Good morning. You know, over the years, I have a lot more seat time out there with all of you than I have behind a podium. And so I think I know what you're thinking, that I am the last obstacle between you and your weekend. So thanks for the time slot, Jason. The good news is I'm not going to get in the way of your weekend. I had a role model years ago that said when you step up to a podium, stop and look at the audience, because every person out there is more important than you think you are. Don't waste their time. I am not going to waste your time, and part of that is because of the presentation you just heard from Cindy Crane. I agree largely with her point of view on how this regional ISO has to go, and much of what she covered is also in my presentation. I may hit a little bit on that. I'll try not to be too repetitive, but just enough to make my point. Now, most or all of you know that things are not always as they appear at first glance. In fact, my favorite 20th century philosopher, the late great Yogi Berra, once said, "I could not tell if they were men or women fans running naked across the field. They had bags over their heads." And that's because it depends on where you look. And the same thing is true for SB 350, Senate Bill 350. That is the bill that was passed by the California legislature last fall that gave the ISO approval to go forward and at least explore the possibility of going regional. You'll hear me refer to it as SB 350 this morning. And I say it's a new model because it is new. If we proceed exactly as SB 350 is written, it'll be different than any other ISO or RTO, which is a cousin of the ISO, as far as governance goes. And that's what I'm going to speak about today is Cindy mentioned governance as being a threshold issue. I could not agree more, and I'm going to go a little bit deeper into that issue. And when I speak of governance, you know, that's a broad term. Think of it in terms of under SB 350, who is going to have the power to control the power? Or another way, who will the ISO board work for? And that's what we're going to talk about this morning. Shortly before SB 350 was passed, the LA Times ran an article about it. And in the article, they interviewed someone who many of you may know or know of, and that is Carl Zaccilla. He is a prominent environmental advocate, a well-respected one, currently with the Natural Resources Defense Council. And they asked Mr. Zaccilla, what would passing of SB 350 mean? And I'm going to show you what he said just to set the tone for what we're going to talk about this morning. There it is. He said it's big because it's always been California's policy and intent to drive policy in other states and in the federal government. So as we go through this, I just want to keep that in the back of your minds and see whether or not you think that SB 350 is designed to do that. And here's what we're going to talk about. It's going to look familiar because I think you just heard a lot about this. Why go regional? And as you heard from Cindy Crane, there are many potential benefits to joining a regional ISO, and volumes have been written about them. And the good news is I'm not going to talk about any of that. In this case, what I'm going to tell you is what I see as California's motivation for wanting the ISO to go regional. Then we'll talk a little bit about the governance model, which, as I pointed out, if it goes through as written, it's going to be different than anything else out there. And approval process, Cindy talked a little bit about that too. I will not get too repetitive on that, but there is one important message that I want to make sure that you hear today about the approval process. And I think Jason set me up by saying it's all about the big picture, and he did not read my slides, I don't think, but it is about the big picture. Okay. Why go regional? California point of view. If you look at their website, the ISO website, it says right up front, it's about the renewables. California has a very aggressive, and I might say a very successful renewable program that they've been working on for years. Their short-term goal is to go 33% retail sales of renewables by 2020. And by just about any measure, they're not only going to succeed, but they will probably even go further than that by 2020. But to do that, it also comes with challenges. California is very heavy in solar energy. And solar energy works best at a certain part of the day when the sun is at the highest and providing the most energy. So what happens is very often in the middle of the day, generation exceeds demand. And the effect that has is in some of these automated markets, especially the 1 hour before market, the value, the cost of that energy not only goes to zero, but sometimes actually goes negative as well. And that's because there's too much energy and there's nowhere to send it. That results in, because they have wasted energy, and it results often in curtailment as well. They want to solve that problem. And it's just going to get worse because their new goal, which is also part of SB 350, just passed this fall, is to go 50% by the end of 2030. In order to meet that goal, California believes that they need a lot more of in-house generation. They probably need to go outside their borders to find renewable generation to import. And they probably need more aggressive demand response programs as well. And the answer is going to be a combination of those things. That's why they want a regional ISO. By doing that, they will, number one, have more markets to export their excess energy that they're receiving from their solar in the middle of the day. And they will have more markets to purchase renewable energy from outside their borders. And they have specifically set their sights on Wyoming and New Mexico wind. Okay, the model. SB 350 gives the ISO the power to go forward and try, and they use the word transform the ISO into a regional organization. And it has many conditions. And this is where there are some bags over the heads of what's going on in SB 350, because you really need to look beyond the four corners of the bill to see how everything fits together. The first condition, this is by far not all the conditions that are there. I'm just trying to highlight some of the most important ones. And in my mind, the most important one is that even when they go regional, the ISO is required to manage the transmission grid and related markets consistent with California environmental, energy, and public health policies and law. Now, most of you know that California has some significant regulations and laws regarding those areas, and they come with a cost. In fact, if they do it exactly that way, if the ISO continues to run the entire expanded grid that Cindy showed you on her chart, and they do it in accordance with California policies, that every little bit of electricity that comes through those transmission lines and through the distribution lines into Wyoming homes and Wyoming businesses is going to have a little bit of California policy attached to it. And I'm not making a statement about whether that's good or bad, but I will say it comes with a price. Secondly, the statute requires the ISO to continually coordinate with state, and by state they mean California, state agencies and local agencies to ensure that they continue to operate in furtherance of consumer and environmental laws. And third, they are required to continue to facilitate tracking and reporting of the California Global Warming Solutions, which is a piece of legislation embedded in the public health laws. And what they do is they track every generating unit in the state, and they count the greenhouse gases and everything else that comes out, and there's a significant reporting and tracking system again, something that is a California thing. I have no problem with California wanting to do that. But what we need to fear is that the cost of running programs like this are going to work their way into things like the transmission access charge that Cindy Crane was talking about. Okay, process. Going to go through this quickly. It's not the sexiest of topics, and I promised I wouldn't waste your time. But in the process, the statute does acknowledge that there probably will be a need to change the governance. But the language in the bill and 99% of the discussion about this since the bill was passed centers around the composition of the board and who gets to appoint the board. That's not the level of governance that we're talking about here today. We're going much more fundamental and who the board is beholden to. Cindy mentioned that there were studies that had to be accomplished prior to going through this. You can see the topics up there. Those studies, there was a webinar. Man, if you love webinars, you need to get involved in this process because they're all over the place. There was a webinar early last week where they came on and they talked about the methodologies they plan to use, and they had some very intelligent economics and regulatory PhDs that talked about sophisticated methodologies to conduct these studies. And they've been, I got to tell you, the ISO and Pacific Corp during this process have been very open, very cooperative. They're not trying to slip anything by, and they're encouraging on a daily basis stakeholder participation. And I congratulate both companies for doing that. But they are ready to go forth with the studies. I believe they're starting to roll on, as Cindy said, right now. After the studies are complete, there's going to be a joint agency workshop, which is interesting. This also shows how things tie together in California, where the joint agencies are going to be the Public Utilities Commission, along with the California Energy Commission and the Air Resources Board. To them, this is all the same thing. It all ties together much more closely than it does here in Wyoming. We're concerned about things like that, but at the Public Service Commission, we are concerned about the companies following the laws regarding environmental issues, and we approve the funds to buy the technology they need to meet it. But it's not forefront in our mind when we decide whether or not the ratepayers are getting the best rates possible. So they're going to have that joint workshop where the ISO will go in and report the results of the studies and present their proposal for governance, which is almost surely under the current statute just going to talk about who's going to appoint the board members. Okay, when that is complete, they're going to submit the proposal to the governor. Governor's going to review it, and if he likes it, he's going to submit it to the legislature. And then for anything to happen, the California legislature has to pass additional law to put into California law what the governance is going to look like. And here's the point I told you about, the important point I wanted to make about the process. All of this is going to be done by the current ISO board through the governor and through the California legislature before a single transmission operator from outside the state is allowed to join the ISO. So this is going to be a California decision, not a regional ISO decision. And then if the other companies in the region, like Pacific Corp, still think it's a good idea, they can look at what California has put into their statute and said, I want to play or I don't. But it's not going to be a new ISO decision. It's going to be an old ISO decision. And Cindy also talked about the timeline. The methodologies for the studies are complete. The studies are beginning, and she mentioned the target of early June. I agree 100% with Cindy that is an over-aggressive target. This is a very important part of whether or not this becomes a regional ISO. It is a threshold issue, and I would encourage anybody who is interested in this issue and has a strong feeling about it one way or the other to get involved in this stakeholder process. Okay, Jason's big picture. The way I see it, the current SB 350 process is less of a transformation, as the statute says, and it is more an expansion of the current ISO across the borders out of California into the other western states. And I say that because it is clear in the current statute that California is very interested in maintaining the fundamental level of control over the ISO board. And the process to get there is also California-centric, as we just discussed. Key decisions like the governance, and I believe with the time schedule for the transmission access charge, I believe that decision right now is California believes a current ISO will decide what the transmission access charge process anyway will be going forward before anyone else joins the regional ISO. And the ISO will continue to exist at the pleasure of the California legislature, which means they gave it birth, they can kill it. They can change the statutes that control the ISO, and there's really not much that the ISO board can do when their founding document, their founding fathers are the California legislature and California statute. And if we go forward that way with California law running the ISO, I think it may be possible, I don't think so, but we would have to find some way to insulate customers outside of California from paying the very expensive rates that are involved with running their environmental and energy programs. California currently has the highest electric rates in the West and almost in the country, and Wyoming has nearly the lowest rates. And when you intermingle the two, it's hard to imagine how they won't find level ground between each other, and that's what we want to be very careful to try and protect from. Brings us back to Mr. Zakella, and think again on whether or not he was being prophetic with his statement last summer. And in case you're not sure, I want to show you a couple more statements. These are from a letter that was dated February 3rd of this year, and it was from several prominent legislators to Governor Brown. The legislators are the president of their Senate, the speaker of their assembly, and the chairpersons of their three most prominent energy-related committees. And the first point was that regionalization, if done improperly, might result in FERC taking over a jurisdiction of the grid. And I think they got that almost right. The only word they got wrong was improperly. And the truth is, if it's done properly, then it'll come under jurisdiction of FERC, which might be a little less California-centric, shall we say. Secondly, if we do it improperly, conflicts will likely be resolved through FERC and ultimately the federal courts rather than through California elected officials. Well, they're right about that too. That's not the way SB 350 is written though. The point they're trying to make here is it was our intent all along to keep the regional ISO under the control of the California legislature. And that's because, as they say, regionalization must not cede the authority of our state's clean energy and climate policies to others who do not have the same strong commitment. Okay. Good thing? Bad thing? I'm not here to answer that question today. My message is be aware of the current approach under SB 350, and if this is important to you, to please get involved. We know it's important to Pacific Corp. We just heard that from Cindy Crane. It's important to us at the Commission, And there are a lot of other people out there that are very involved in the process that are going to try and make this point. And where it goes, we'll find out sometime during the next year. And I encourage you and hope that you get involved. And that big questions there is really for Cindy Crane, who didn't get her questions yet. So I encourage you at this point to ask Cindy any questions that you might have.